All right, welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at a Reddit thread. It really gets into some interesting questions about intimacy and how our brains seem to react when things get a little blurry between reality and fantasy.
Oh, yeah. It's amazing how these little stories that people share online can really open these huge discussions.
Absolutely. So we're over in the Guy Cry subreddit today, and the original poster is a 21-year-old guy from Australia, and he's never had a girlfriend. So he decides to visit a brothel that offers a girlfriend experience.
Girlfriend experience. I think that's an interesting place to start already.
Right. I mean, it definitely suggests that maybe he's looking for something a little more than just a physical encounter, right?
Absolutely.
So he picks someone,
Yeah.
and they do have sex. But then the rest of the time is spent just cuddling
Hmm.
and talking about normal, everyday stuff, like,
Yeah.
cars and pets and what they want to do with their lives. Normal date stuff.
It's like he's trying to simulate a relationship, even in this setting that you wouldn't normally associate with that.
Exactly. And the really interesting part is what happens afterward.
Yeah. What happens after?
He starts feeling really sad after he leaves. Like he actually misses this woman.
Mm.
But he knows it was a paid service.
Mm.
And he even wonders if maybe he feels this way because he's literally never felt this close to another person before. So it makes you wonder, right? Like, is this all in his head? Or is there something more to it?
Well, there's definitely a biological component here. We got to remember that our brains don't always differentiate between different sources of intimacy. So when we experience physical closeness, our bodies release all these hormones like oxytocin, which is sometimes called the cuddle hormone, and dopamine, which is associated with pleasure and reward. And these things can make us feel very attached and bonded regardless of the circumstances.
So he's not imagining this. These feelings are rooted in real biological processes.
Exactly.
But there's the psychological side of this too, right?
Oh, absolutely. In this case, he's experiencing a simulation of intimacy and validation and attention, all things that can contribute to a very powerful emotional experience, even if the foundation of it is fabricated.
So that brings us to how the Reddit community responded to his post. Because there's actually a wide range of perspectives.
A lot of people immediately reminded him that the woman was simply doing her job. It was a service she was providing, a performance, really, designed to give him what he was looking for.
Which is a valid point, right? It reminds us that at its core, this was a transaction. But then some of the comments got into these really interesting psychological concepts that might actually explain what this guy's going through.
Like the halo effect.
Right, the halo effect.
It's basically this tendency that our brains have to fill in the blanks about a person based on our initial impressions of them. Like if you meet someone and they're attractive and friendly, you might automatically assume that they're also intelligent and trustworthy, even if you have no evidence to support that.
So he might be projecting all these positive qualities onto this woman
Okay.
based on this very limited interaction.
Exactly. He's creating an idealized version of her in his mind, which just intensifies those feelings of attachment.
Oh, it's kind of heartbreaking, isn't it? You can really sense how much he's longing for connection, and it just seems like he wandered into something way more complicated than he expected.
It highlights that deep human need for intimacy. And like a lot of the commenters said, there's actually a potential danger in creating this false image of a relationship.
Because it sets him up for unrealistic expectations in future relationships.
Precisely. He might start chasing this idealized version of a connection instead of embracing the reality of relationships, which are messy and complicated. And that brings us to another big theme in the comments: authenticity.
Yeah, so many people were encouraging him to look for genuine connections in the real world, where there's mutual interest and where both people can be their true selves.
Where it's not built on a transaction. Finding places where you can build relationships that are real and meaningful and free from those power dynamics that are inherent in sex work.
And the thread also led to some really interesting conversations about the ethics of sex work in general.
Yeah, there were a lot of different opinions on that. Some people expressed concern about the industry as a whole and argued against being involved with it at all.
Which is a reminder that there are so many layers to this story. And it's important to be respectful of all the viewpoints, while also acknowledging how complex this industry is. It's not about finding one right answer. It's about recognizing all the nuance.
Absolutely. It's a conversation that requires a lot of thought and an understanding of the potential for harm.
Right. In the end, it's important to remember that the original poster is a young man dealing with some really intense emotions.
Yeah, he is.
But it sounds like he's doing some reflecting and coming to some realizations on his own. Yeah. He mentioned that he doesn't even actually remember what the woman looks like. He just remembers the positive feelings, Which is interesting, right? That's how our brains can work. Sometimes we create these idealized memories.
Almost as like he's grieving the loss of a fantasy rather than an actual person.
Yeah. And ultimately, he decided not to go back. He wants to focus on his career and look for genuine relationships out in the world.
It sounds like he's moving in a positive direction, recognizing the need for real connection and shifting away from trying to find those feelings in a transactional environment.
This deep dive has already given us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that wanting connection is totally natural. But we have to be careful about the context and make sure we're not confusing these fleeting, fabricated experiences with actual love.
It's about making sure we're putting our emotional energy in the right places and focusing on relationships where we can be ourselves.
This has been part 1 of our look at this Reddit thread. We'll be back soon to continue exploring the complexities of human connection. And we'll even be sharing some tips on how to cultivate those genuine relationships that we're all looking for.
So stay tuned for part 2.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this Reddit thread. It's amazing how this one guy's experience has sparked such a huge conversation about intimacy and connection and what love even means these days.
It really shows you how even in this digital age, we're still all searching for that connection, that sense of belonging.
Exactly. And as we go deeper in these comments, you can see why so many people related to this story, because it's about those universal experiences,
Yeah.
those feelings that we've probably all felt at some point,
Yeah.
like that deep longing for connection, or even just trying to figure out the difference between being infatuated with someone and actually being in love.
It's a theme that you see everywhere, right?
Big
In
time.
books and movies and songs. And now we see it playing out in online spaces. Like people are turning to Reddit to share their stories and get advice from this massive community.
What's interesting to me is how this thread encouraged some people to open up about their own experiences with finding connection, like their own journeys.
Yeah. A lot of people talked about how true connection takes time. It takes vulnerability and letting go of those perfect images we have in our heads of what a relationship should be.
One commenter talked about how they thought they were in love when they were younger, but it was really just that excitement of the unknown, not a true connection based on compatibility.
It shows how our brains can play tricks on us, make us think we found the one based on feelings that aren't really that deep.
Like we write this whole story in our minds and try to force reality to fit into it, even if it doesn't really make sense.
It's like writing the story before you've actually lived through the events.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to be willing to change the story as we get to know ourselves better and the people around us.
Exactly.
Which brings us to another point that kept popping up in the comments, that finding real connection usually means getting outside of our comfort zones.
A lot of people talked about putting yourself out there, joining groups, trying new hobbies, doing things you're passionate about. That's how you meet people who share your interests.
Creating those opportunities for connections to happen naturally.
Instead of looking for them in these prepackaged experiences
Yeah.
or only looking online. Because even though technology can help us connect, real intimacy needs those face-to-face interactions, shared experiences, being vulnerable and letting people see the real you.
Totally. And there were also some comments about how important self-awareness is for building those genuine connections.
Right. People were encouraging the original poster to really think about his needs and his desires and the patterns he has in relationships, because understanding yourself is a huge part of connecting with others in a real and honest way.
It's about knowing who you are and what you bring to a relationship and what you want in a partner, instead of trying to be someone you're not.
And being honest with yourself about any insecurities or fears you have that might be stopping you from making those connections.
So we've talked about the science behind feeling attached, the psychology of expectations, and the importance of being authentic and finding connections in the real world. As we wrap up this deep dive, what really stood out to you?
It's been a great discussion with so many interesting points. What about you?
For me, I think it's that reminder that genuine connection is a journey. It's not a destination. And it's often in those unexpected moments where we're vulnerable and share something real that we make those deep connections.
I agree. And remembering that wanting connection is normal. It's part of being human. But we have to be smart about where we're putting our energy and make sure we're building relationships that actually feed our souls.
It reminds us that love, when it's real, is about give and take. It's about respect and being willing to face the good and the bad together.
And sometimes the most fulfilling connections are the ones that surprise us and challenge us and help us become the best versions of ourselves.
This deep dive has definitely given us all a lot to think about. But before we go, I just want to acknowledge that figuring out relationships can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Oh, yeah. It can be a lot.
And that's when it's so important to reach out for support.
Yeah. Talking to a therapist or joining a support group Or even just confiding in friends and family who care about you can give you the guidance and support you need. So don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that we're not alone in this. Everyone wants to feel connected, and sometimes we need a little help figuring things out.
Absolutely. Therapy can be a great resource, or support groups, or even just talking to friends and family who you trust can make a big difference.
Totally. And it's a journey, right? Like figuring yourself out and building those connections. That's something we're always working on. It's about being open to learning and growing and changing.
Yeah, it's about accepting that we're all a little messy and imperfect. And even the best relationships take work. It takes communication and
Yeah.
being willing to show up as your true self.
So to everyone listening, we want to leave you with this thought. How are you actively searching for those real, meaningful connections in a world that can feel so disconnected sometimes?
It's a big question, right? And we would love to hear your thoughts on it. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure you subscribe to Voices of the Soul and check out our YouTube channel, Shauna Plage, for more discussions like this.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep searching for those real moments of human connection that make life so amazing.